format for curriculum and instruction, which is very compelling for gifted kids. And that's really why I want to start today. For those of you who are new to the field, perhaps, and not so familiar with the connections that we can make, I want to start with this first point, which is that there's really only one reason to alter curriculum for gifted students. And that reason is because their learning needs are different as a result of their differences. Just as a quick review, we know from the research evidence that the gifted mind is hallmarked by rapid learning, right? They absorb facts like a sponge. It's one of the ways we notice them and one of the ways we identify. We know that when people get a bunch of ideas together, a number of facts, it does more than just accumulate, it changes the way they think. And one of the changes is that gifted kids, earlier than other kids, are capable of conceptual learning, abstract thinking. We know from a lot of personality research that gifted kids are more inclined to inquiry than other kids. They are the question askers. We also know that they are hallmarked by a sense of intensity or openness to experience, this kind of intellectual risk-taking that they're willing to take, and that they get very, very passionate. In fact, we see from the research in psychology that openness to experience is related to IQ, that it is in turn also related to things like creativity, to moral reasoning, to beliefs about knowledge, that knowledge is still yet to be explored and that it is unknown instead of being known. We know that it comes along with a certain level of emotional awareness. And there's interesting link here between this and MB, the Myers-Briggs intuition sensing scale, such that gifted kids tend to be more intuitive, where it's typically developing kids tend to be more sensing. The second thing that we need to think about when we think about curriculum for gifted kids is because they're different, our goals for gifted education ought to be different. We shouldn't be aspiring to the same goals as everyone else in the district, even though we need to be aligned to the Common Core and science standards and everything else. We need to be striving to a different direction. And I often think we don't think enough about what the long-term aims of gifted education ought to be. Not our aims for this year, but if we think about the K-12 trajectory, what are we trying to prepare kids for? For me, gifted education ought to be a journey towards expertise. It's a journey they won't end at the end of 12th grade or even at the end of undergraduate school or graduate school. Right? Expertise is a lifelong journey, but we need to be doing what we can to prepare them. And we know that experts have a lot of knowledge. That's okay. We know gifted kids have a lot of knowledge too, so check, right? We know that experts are good at thinking skills. So what we know from the research about gifted kids is if we don't put them at their edge, they won't use thinking skills. Rather, they will rely on their lower level thinking skills and just sort of go on cruise control. We know that experts are good at problem solving. And in fact, it's the daily bread and butter of experts to tackle a certain kind of problem, the messy, ill-structured, or wicked problem. We know that experts are more likely to engage in metacognition, to plan what they do, to reflect on what they're doing, and then to evaluate and improve their practice. We know that experts have a large tolerance for ambiguity. They're okay with not knowing the answer really quickly, and they are engaged in the journey as much as they are in the destination. And the one thing that we don't talk a lot about in our field is that experts are also known for their passion. No matter who you look at, if you read the biographies of people who are creative and eminent adults, they talk about being completely sucked in by what they're doing, about losing time, about feeling hooked is a word you hear a lot, hooked by what they do, passionate, engaged, a love of their field. And I don't think we talk about that enough in gifted education. We don't want to lose that sense of love. This is something that was also interesting to this man, Howard Barrows. He's the guru of problem-based learning in the medical school. He noticed that his very gifted students would graduate from medical school with straight A's, having done very well at memorizing the anatomy of the human body, having done very well at scoring on the medical, tests in order to get their license. But then they would go out into the field and they would struggle as practitioners. And after just a little investigation, he discovered that, well, the reason is that medical school is actually very different from medical practice. And he started an investigation of what would it look like if I turned medical school into a model where it looked like medical practice. And he started creating curriculum where kids would go in, his graduate students would go in, and instead of opening a textbook on the first day of class, they would meet their first simulated patient. And they'd meet patient after patient after patient who would reveal symptoms to the students, and the students would have to ask the questions that a doctor asks of a patient. So they had to learn good question asking skills. They had to learn good bedside skills. At the same time, they were learning all of the information they needed in order to be good doctors. And that is the heart and soul of the medical model of problem-based learning. Now, when I was working at the Illinois Math and Science Academy, I had an opportunity to meet Howard because he came to speak to us. And we looked at what he was doing and we looked at its resonance with inquiry-based education. And we thought, wow, if that's good enough for graduate school and medical school, it's got to be good enough for high school. And that's sort of where my journey in problem-based learning began. Now, I have to confess, at this point in a presentation, I would typically try to do a demo lesson. And in this case, I would be trying to take you out to the great prairie lands of Colorado to begin a demonstration. But in the interest of time today, I'm going to just sort of talk you through what might happen on the first day of a PBL class based on this scenario. And I was just trying to copy it. I'm sorry that this is so disorganized, but this is a memo that comes to you from the Black-footed Ferret Reintroduction Recovery Team from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Fort Collins. It's complaining because the problem of the black-footed ferret reintroduction isn't moving quickly enough. There's bad media involved in this situation, that it's too expensive and it's labor intensive, that the human climate around this problem was getting more and more negative, that given the current economy, they need to show results. Something has to change. Something has to change around the genetic bottleneck, which is getting in the way of the recovery. And it goes on from there. So students read through this scenario, which I'm going to actually see if I can share it in its, nope, I've lost my, never mind. I'm going to just go on. As students read through this, they have enough information to get a sense of what's going on, but not enough information to move forward. What they need to do first is ask some questions. And so they'll fill out a learning frame like this. It's like a KWL in our language, but what's cute is that in medicine, they think they invented this. Anyway, they have to identify what they know about the situation. They have to identify questions that they have, and then they have to come up with an action plan. So the way it unfolds is you just gather the kids' questions, which are guided by the reading they've done in the introduction. What do we know? Well, the attempts to save the black-footed ferret is expensive and labor intensive. We haven't shown any results. We're not going fast enough. The attention from the media has been negative or poor. And then, what questions do you have about this situation? And this is where the list gets really long. All coming from the kids, none of them coming from me as the teacher. They've got a 2-week deadline. So what can we get done in 2 weeks? What have we done already? What's going on with the habitat? Is that the problem? What kind of shelter does the black-footed ferret need? How can we improve public opinion? What kind of diseases might be getting in the way of the black-footed ferret? How much money do we have? Always a good question. What is a genetic bottleneck? Is Fort Collins a natural habitat for the ferret, or are we actually trying to transport it to a new location? What is a model habitat? Are the ferrets thriving anywhere? What do ferrets eat? What eats a ferret? And by listing these questions from the kids, they become invested in the problem. We then have to have them with all these questions, far too many for them to answer. We have them triage their list. Which of these do we need to answer first in order to make progress? And because people are predictable, you can pretty much count on a core set of issues. Here, this is a demo that I did with a group, and they selected the questions in bold. What are the issues with the habitat? So we need to know something about the habitat of Fort Collins, Colorado. What is a genetic bottleneck? And what might that have to do with the problem? Are the black-footed ferrets thriving anywhere? And then we need to know more about the ferret, like what's the predator-prey relationship? What do they eat and what eats them? With those 5 questions, we can then derive a plan of action. How are we going to find out the information about the black-footed ferret that we need to make progress, because we've got to be done in 2 weeks? And this is where we get to help the kids diversify their response to information seeking away from, well, just Google it, to something more dynamic. Can we do an interview with a scientist? Can we read maps of Fort Collins, Colorado, and take a look at the terrain and the topography? Can we do a simulation in order to understand a genetic bottleneck better? And from there, we derive a complex, interesting, interactive set of learning activities all around the issue of what at heart tends to be the study of ecosystems, about genetics and genetic makeup, and about humans' impact on the environment. So that's the heart and soul of how a problem-based learning unit begins. But let me go back now into a little bit of theory and practice. Problem-based learning, and this is not a complete definition, so don't write this down, and you'll get the slides anyway. It's a form of inquiry-based education where learning is initiated with an ill-structured problem and students direct their own course of study, sort of. Just like I would not send my 16-year-old son out on ice the first time he drives a car, so we do not want to send kids out into independent investigation without proper scaffolding first. So what we want to do is to create an environment where students learn how to direct their own course of study. They may need more support and scaffolding at the first attempt than they do 2 or 3 problems down the line. So that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to create this bubble where they are safely learning how to be independent learners. The other thing that I think gives problem-based learning credibility is because of its source in the medical school program. You know, people in medical school are really, really invested in kids learning core content. We all want our medical doctors to learn good core content. And so the fact that this is documented in medical school to be as effective in transferring content knowledge as it is in developing the other skills that it develops, I think gives it great credibility for us as educators. One question that I get very, very often is, you know, PBL or PBL? What's the difference between problem-based learning and project-based learning? And I would have to say that when each is done at the highest standard, they are very similar. I think what happens in project-based learning is that sometimes the doing takes over from the thinking. And that can be a real problem. That, you know, for instance, I've heard somebody say, you know, you can make a sugar cube replica of the White House without learning anything about government or architecture. And sometimes when things are running behind, it's just sort of get it done. In problem-based learning, The thinking is always the centerpiece of what's going on. It's always about your reasoning around how the problem is going to get solved. Generally, there is a project of some sort within each problem-based learning. Like in this problem, the kids have to create a model ecosystem to demonstrate how they're going to handle the issue of reintroducing the black-footed ferret. But that project is in service of the thinking. It's a reflection of the inquiry that they've done. So to me, that's the difference. The reason I think problem-based learning is better for gifted education is because it is rooted in inquiry. In fact, it is rooted in the third theory of Jerome Bruner, who is the granddaddy of inquiry. Experiencing subject matter from an expert's perspective. That's really what we want to do. Jerome Bruner was the guy who said premature closure on a productive question can destroy imagination. Oversimplification and dogmatism are the twin enemies of creative thought. And concepts are worthless unless they lead children to new explorations. That's what guides problem-based learning. And there's the introduction that I hoped you would have in a much better format, out of order in my slides. So I'm glad you have a copy of this going forward. So if we want to take a look at the heart of problem-based learning, we want to think about three key pieces. The ill-structured problem, putting students in a stakeholder role, and then moving the teacher into the role of what they call a metacognitive coach. Ill-structured problems or messy problems or wicked problems are this, they are a mess, not a well-structured problem with an answer in the back of the book, but they are a problem that can't be answered on the first day of the unit because you really need more information before you can even understand what's going on. Learning through an ill-structured problem ends up having educational benefits that are very different from learning through a well-structured problem. It can't be defined with a high degree of completeness, which helps work on tolerance of ambiguity. It even can't be solved with a high degree of certainty. At some point, the kids are going to have to decide in this problem the extent to which they are going to care about the ranchers on the prairie and the cows and who has the right to that land more. It's really an ethical dilemma to some extent. And they won't know whether they were right about it. They were just going to have to make the best decision they can at this place and time. That's very much like the real world problem solving we hope that they will do as experts when they're adults. Ill-structured problem solving is the center of expert activity. It's what they do day in and day out. That's why they're experts. There are educational benefits. We know that people learn content better when it's associated in a network of understanding. So kids actually learn more, and they learn more ancillary information as they research. You learn process knowledge of how to approach a situation, the kind of skills and tools you need to get through the problem. You learn how to deal with multiple solution paths and to walk those paths until there is a reason for them to be abandoned. You learn about decision making, evaluative thinking, the highest level, among the highest levels of thinking, making a judgment based on criteria. And then you learn how to use metacognition. All of those expert skills come through learning with an ill-structured problem. But for the kids, problem-based learning is learning through a story. It's realistic fiction. And kids love suspending disbelief. They love entering into this environment. And I've seen this everywhere from 2nd grade to 12th grade, everywhere from underachieving students to highly gifted students. Kids love stories. We need to take advantage of that. In our case, we're working with a mystery, which as human beings, we are hardwired to respond to. Brene Brown talks about stories as data with a soul. And I just love the idea that our curriculum could be data, but with a soul. I think that makes all the difference in terms of student investment. Stories also have unique cognitive impact, that they create neural pathways that connect cognition and emotion. And stories are more memorable than other narratives, which means we're creating that network of knowledge where once the kids go through the black-footed ferret problem, you say ferret to them and they can tell you about the prairie, they can talk to you about ranchers, they can talk to you about prairie dogs, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the whole thing comes up in the same net of association. So in problem-based learning, all of the student growth is rooted inside of this problem and the questions that the kids ask. And as they answer one set of questions, another set of questions emerges. The reason this is critical in terms of cognition and problem-based learning is that people only engage in critical thinking when they perceive a need for it. If they don't perceive the need, they won't engage. So we need to get the kids, again, on their edge in order to access those thinking skills and work with them. Fortunately, the world is filled with problems, and a lot of my units are ripped from the headlines, either contemporary headlines or headlines from the past, in order to make the question of why am I learning this a little irrelevant. The relevancy is clear because it is they are things that actually have happened or are happening in our world. They know why somebody needed to know this knowledge. The important thing to understand in a problem-based learning setting is that it's not that you're going out of control. In fact, these are very well-constructed, ill-structured problems. I have put in there something about a genetic bottleneck so that the kids will ask about a genetic bottleneck. I've put things in about the habitat because I want them to be looking at ecosystems. So I have seeded this with the curriculum I want them to learn. And that's fine. That's my job. It's a little sneaky, but that's okay. The idea is that I am creating the environment for them to ask the questions I want them to ask, but I am in control at the level of the story. I can predict what's going to happen because this is my narrative. They are the protagonist in the story, walking through, finding things, learning new information, and taking the next step. As the storyteller, I can change the story and add to the story anytime I want to during the course of the problem. Here we have what we call a kicker for the problem. It is a kicker about prairie dogs, which end up being really important, and about cheatgrass. And what they're looking at is the response that a rancher would have to the prairie dogs. Are the cattle at risk? Is cheatgrass taking over the prairies, leaving them without something to eat? Is there bubonic plague? It raises a lot of new issues for the kids, and you can revise these any way you want. But the idea is that if the kids are going in the wrong direction, or if I want them to go in a new direction, I simply add a chapter to the story. Here's another one. So again, these are absolutely yours as the author of this narrative to use or to not use as you help the kids make their way through the problem. So if we're working on an immersion in significant content through an expert's point of view, then who are the kids? They are the protagonist or a stakeholder in the problem, or a term I'm becoming fonder of is they are an apprentice. Now, there are lots of different forms of apprenticeship. Some are more successful than others, but key to the idea of an apprenticeship is that an expert is transferring knowledge and skills to a novice. And that's really what we're trying to get at. Now, I have a lengthy definition of apprenticeship here, which I will let you read at your leisure, but I think the core things that are important and the reason why this is good for gifted education is that it is theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge. It's looking at what the core of the field is It's the expert demonstrating what they know, and then the novice modeling that, taking on the practices, learning the information, and it's a slow transfer over time where the expert is dominant at the beginning, but the novice becomes more and more the center and the leader as they acquire knowledge and skills. Or in terms that Michael Clay Thompson uses, which he gave in a keynote, which I absolutely love, he says, in the best curriculum, a student acts as a hero, willing to become an unknown self. So the kids get to imagine, gee, what's it like to be a biologist working in the field somewhere in Colorado where I've got negative press going on, but I really want to care about this little black-footed ferret, but the ranchers are asking me why the ferret is more important than human beings are. It's not just being a scientist in a lab coat. This is much more dynamic than that. But what it's like to be a journalist, or what it's like to be a congressperson, or what it's like to be a lawyer, or a marine biologist. It's a kind of on-the-job training that where the kids learn not only the content and the skills that they need to know, but the set of ethical practices that they have to follow, the kinds of interactions that they need to have with others. It is a much more dynamic and comprehensive introduction. So in each one of our problems, the kids take on a central role, somebody who has authority and accountability and responsibility for doing something about the problem. This kind of storytelling also has an impact on learning in what people in the studies of literature call transportation theory, that it deepens empathy and investment in the problem, and that far from wanting kids to be detached and objective, you actually do want kids to have some level of investment in what they're learning, because we engage further with things where we attach emotionally. And we all know from our own childhoods, from our own children, from our own students, that kids know the stories they learn. They can tell you chapter and verse about BB-8 or about Robin Hood or about any story they connect to. In fact, in this fascinating book called Emotions, Learning, and the Brain, Mary Helen Imordino Yang documents that complex emotional feelings actually connect to higher level thinking. So the more investment there is, the more likely you are to get deep and meaningful thinking. She says, it is neurobiologically impossible to think deeply about things you don't care about. And I think we've all had that experience with our kids. So in problem-based learning, it's not a simulation. I'm not going to divide up the room and make some kids the ranchers and some kids the environmentalists and some kids the press. Rather, in order to engage in sort of collective metacognition, what we want to do is to have everybody on this journey together. They are all these biological researchers, and some of them may be tasked to talking to the ranchers or talking to the journalists. But we want them to come back together and think together. What has happened today? Where do we need to go with this? How can we make progress so that they can take advantage of each other's thinking and they learn how to think at that higher level together? It is, in fact, a form of community of practice, if you're using that model in New Mexico these days. A group of people who share a concern or a passion for something and learn to do it better by interacting regularly. So I've set up my problem in a kind of sneaky way, my well-structured, ill-structured problem. And that's going to create a situation where the curriculum is coming at me instead of from me. It's driven by the kids' questions, and they are always motivated by their own questions more than they are motivated by my questions. So they've got a little bit extra investment there. It's a mystery, which again is something that we connect to as human beings. We've got them a little more invested through use of this stakeholder role where they are put in the center of this problem and they are expected to act. So with the curriculum coming at me and with the kids more engaged, I am free to be the kind of teacher I always wanted to be. The guide on the side instead of the sage on the stage, right? And in problem-based learning, they call this the metacognitive coach. The idea being that we are there to really help the kids think about their thinking and make good decisions. In fact, I like to think about the metacognitive coach as being a cross between a cruise director and Socrates. You know, on the one hand, there's stuff the kids have to do. They need to divide up their questions and create groups and investigate the ecosystem. Yeah, investigate genetic bottlenecks, learn about the public attitudes towards this problem. And then they all need to come back together after organizing their activities and keeping the story going. They need to come together as and be with you as your role as Socrates, helping them think about what they've learned. What information is valid? What information isn't? Where is their bias? What questions have they answered? What do they need to go back and look at again? What are new questions they need to address? So we learn to help them think with this new knowledge and the new perspectives that they're gaining. All the while, we want to encourage their becoming increasingly independent from us as they make their choices and create their paths to problem solving, because we know that sometimes it's valuable to hit a wall and learn how to back away from that. And again, this is not random education. There is a plan to what can happen inside of this unit, and you can predict to some extent what the kids will need. This goes to my third point about curriculum and gifted students, which is this. We talk a lot about curriculum models in our field, and models are important to some extent, but what goes inside that model is even more important. It's the day-to-day of what happens, which is going to result in higher order thinking, at least as much as the model will. This is what I think of as the relationship between the model and the lesson in a curriculum, right? The model is the chrysalis that's surrounding an emerging butterfly. It provides a casing that fits around what's going on inside. It creates the shape and the structure of what's going to happen. But what's happening is actually on the inside. It is the butterfly, the caterpillar dissolving and the butterfly transforming and emerging in its new form. So the work of the situation happens inside the lesson as opposed to happening inside the model. I would also say that because of this, PBL as a model is not inherently appropriate for gifted students. It leans towards gifted students because of its inquiry orientation, because of the ill-structuredness of it. It appeals to that aspect of their personality. But I have seen PBL light, just as I've seen integrated curriculum model light. I've seen just about every model done at levels that are not in-depth or complex enough for gifted students. PBL is great for kids in the regular classroom because they need to learn how to function this way in the 21st century classroom or world. The inherent goals of problem-based learning are for kids to learn core content. This is not problem solving on Fridays because it's raining and you forgot to rent a movie, can't go outside. It's about learning required content in a different way. It's about problem solving and conceptual reasoning because it's hard to get through this problem, for instance, without talking about things like systems. It's about learning how to research in numerous different ways. It's about accessing different styles of thinking skills. Often you can build in ethics and the good dispositions of thinking and metacognition. All of those can be encased in a problem-based learning opportunity if you choose to put them in there. And you almost have to get some of it in, which I love, because it's not a question of, oh, how can I elbow in a little bit of time for problem solving, or how can I find time to talk about this concept? It sort of all fits under this umbrella very naturally. And it happens as you move through the flow of a PBL unit, starting with engagement, which is what I sort of talked you through this morning, this idea of the unraveling of the problem, the unfolding of the questions, and the prioritizing of them in order to get started. But that's naturally followed by a period of time where the kids are going to have to do some research and some thinking about their research. So inquiry and investigation into the problem. We're going to define the problem only after we've done a little bit of research. We're not going to define it on the first day because they're not going to understand it well enough. And even after defining the problem, they're not done. They still have to come up with some sort of resolution. And we use resolution instead of solution because we know that our problem solution, or what we come up with, is probably going to lead into some other unanticipated situations that it's not going to end. It's just going to be at a new place when we're done. And then at that point, after the kids give their resolution, the problem itself is done, but the literature on PBL in medical school suggests that it's really important to go through a period of debriefing, where you review the problem with the students, you go through the content that they found, you compare it with what an expert might have known or done, you think about what you did right and what you did wrong, that big metacognitive piece. And that sets the stage for them to engage in the next PBL scenario. As the kids move through these phases of problem solving, you have an opportunity to insert all sorts of thinking strategies and skills that you already use. This is not necessarily about reinventing the wheel, it's about reorganizing the wheel. So you can think about, at what point do I want to build in some sort of research strategy, and what's my focus for research in this problem? Do the kids need to do a Socratic seminar around a particular reading? Am I going to have them work on written or oral communications in this problem? How do I want them to organize their information? Is there a graphic organizer I want them to use, and which one might be best for this problem? How do I want them to work together collaboratively? For me, decision-making around writing a problem-based learning scenario is more about cutting out strategies than building them in, because there's so much opportunity and richness involved in the environment. And then for gifted kids, we have the opportunity to build in that higher level of content and thinking, the conceptual piece of systems in this problem, the idea of biology and habitats, the primary information that they can use and access reading research articles and primary resource documents, and the idea of perspective taking and considering multiple dimensions always in this situation. So I can embed all sorts of instruction. I'm not going to teach them the content of this problem, but as their coach, I'm going to show them the skills and tools they need to think their way through it. So I can teach them how to read a map, how to do an experiment, how to analyze data, all sorts of opportunities for me to really build their thinking around meaningful content. They've brought the content to the table through their research. I am adding skills to that. So in the black-footed ferret problem that I have available, you'll see a set of lessons. A lot of the lessons, like the ferret facts and habitat threats and systems and risks, those don't necessarily have to happen in a particular order. Part of the metacognitive learning for the kids could be to choose which lesson they think they need first, and to think about what the sequence of their learning ought to be. That's a very important part of self-directed learning. But all of the lessons are there and predictable needs of the kids. So you can be prepared to that extent, certainly. So some of the activities the kids engage in, again, this is not different from what you would do. It's just organized differently. So there's writing in a problem log. They have writing prompts that will help them summarize what they've learned. Graphic organizers to help them think about cause and effect and to think backwards from the situation they're in to try to determine what the root cause of the problem might be. This kind of backwards thinking is particularly challenging for kids, and for them to think about not only the immediate cause, but what's the cause of that immediate cause. So the cause of the cause, so that they can really create a pathway back to the beginning of the problem. And that's an example the student did. We have a simulation of a genetic bottleneck where we use pony beads to represent different genetic traits. And we start with colors. We later unmask those colors as representing different genetically transferable traits, like how fast you run or how strong your jaw is. And then we create a bottleneck where we cut off the number of genes that can be transferred from one generation to the next. And the kids take a look at what happens when you lose your ability to run. What happens when your front paws can't dig a hole to create your own home anymore? What happens when you can't snap off the head of your predator in order to gain sustenance? So they take a look at the impact of genetic bottlenecks and the importance of genetic variation and the transfer of genes from one generation to the next. We build in intentional conceptual reasoning. And again, here, what I like to emphasize is, in gifted education, we talk a lot about getting the big idea, and it's very important for kids to get the big idea as part of their learning. But for an expert, a concept is more than a big idea. It is a tool. It's a tool that they use to see the world differently. And I think it's really important that kids learn not only the definitions of the concepts and how to connect them to data, but they need to learn how to use the concepts as a means of analysis, of a means of structuring information so that they can reorganize what they know. So the generalizations in this unit go beyond just defining what a system is, but it goes to the idea that elements of a system have to operate in appropriate balance and proportion. Balance doesn't mean the same. Balance means at some point there is an equal weight. That when one part of a system breaks down, everything breaks down. One thing is at risk, everything is at risk. We also have a very specific and action-oriented approach to problem definition, which again happens only after the kids have done some investigation. Einstein said once that if he had 100 minutes to solve a problem, he'd spend 99 minutes defining it and 1 minute on coming up with a solution. This is such a pivotal moment, and yet it is the one that I have found that teachers are most likely to just skip over. But you can't solve a problem unless you know what you're about. And so we always take the time in these units to come up with a problem definition that addresses the issue, like how can we reintroduce the black-footed ferret, but also acknowledges the constraints, which is the real world part of this. Like, do you want to take the needs of the ranchers and their livelihoods into account? Do you want to take into account the limitations of the habitat that might put the black-footed ferret at risk? Do we want to make sure that the black-footed ferret can survive on its own without human assistance eventually? All of these constraints will change the way we view the problem and our approach to the solution. I've got an example here that I just heard on the radio one day. I was so amazed to hear a politician like completely use this structure. I'm not trying to prohibit helicopter traffic. I'm just trying to establish some regulatory framework to try to improve quality of life in a way that doesn't impede law enforcement and at the same time provides some relief for my constituents. So he identifies one issue, this framework for helicopter traffic, and his constraints are it can't impede law enforcement and it's got to provide relief to my constituents. So just a model of what we're about. So we make the kids take the time to do the hard thinking around what exactly is the problem we're trying to solve, what we are going to attend to, what we're going to choose to maybe not attend to. These constraints are the core of creativity. Creativity doesn't happen in a vacuum. Creativity really is often how we deal with constraints when we're trying to create or come up with something new. So we want them to jump that wall. At that point, the kids are ready to come into problem resolution, which is where they use their evaluative thinking. They are considering solution options and weighing those against different criteria. Often we find that the criteria for the problem are actually right there in the problem definition. How can we have the black-footed ferret survive while helping the ranchers survive and while the ferrets are independent and things like that. So here, the kids have decided one of their criteria is it's got to be a self-sustaining model. Humans have got to be able to back out. And they're looking at solution options, like providing a protected area for prairie dogs, because black-footed ferrets need a lot of prairie dogs for sustenance. Maybe vaccinate black-footed ferrets to keep them from falling victim to bubonic plague, which is a real thing. Relocating the prairie dogs to a national park area. And for each criteria, they weigh the value of their solution ideas, and they come up with a solution really packaged more than a single idea. And then there's the presentation of their model. And it could either be the construction of the model itself, it could be writing a newspaper editorial or doing a press conference if you want them to work on their oral communication skills. Again, lots of different variations, lots of options for you to consider depending on what your kids need, depending on what your timing is like, depending on what your priorities are as an instructor. And throughout this, you are assessing. And in many ways, you are assessing in the same way that you've always assessed, but you're building it again to this environment, right? You have all of these lessons that go into the student's understanding of the problem. And in what we call a problem log or a problem journal portfolio, we have opportunities to assess what they've learned, their content knowledge, the process skills that they've used, like how well they've done their research, the analysis they've done through the assessment of graphic organizers and other analytic tools, and taking a look at their reflections on the problem and how they're thinking. We also have a number of rubrics for their action, right? Well, the problem log would assess their thinking. We have a number of rubrics around presentation skills, around communication skills. This is presentation rubric. And then this rubric that was developed by my ex-stepson, which is a 21st century term, but he's a great social studies teacher in St. Charles, Illinois. And this describes the activity of problem-based learning. So how well you have engaged in the classroom during the course of the problem, in terms of the quality of their work, in terms of their class participation, and in terms of their group work or collaborative behavior. And what I really love about this rubric was what happens down in the lower right-hand corner. The kids who are tardy, truant, absent, disrupting class, not taking notes, falling asleep in class. You know, everybody knows who that kid is, and they know if it's them. And the kids love this rubric because it speaks truth to them. We have kids engage in metacognition in many ways. One of them is a reflection in the problem log. So here's an example of a prompt. Scientists tend to be devoted to the areas they study. Why would a degree of passion or devotion be necessary? And what happens when passion gets in the way? So we have kids reflect on their own emotional intensity with respect to this problem and think about the role of passion, both positive and negative. Or you can use a reflective moment to think about conceptualizing the problem. What are some of the negative consequences of an unbalanced system? Or what are some of the consequences of having the system go out of balance? So again, a variety and diversity of assignments that can go in, from looking at their notes to these reflections we just looked at, to looking at their research, having them list the top 5 facts, which are the 5 most important things that we've discovered today, and how do they relate to the problem. They could do, you could assess their experimental design as they look at the genetic bottleneck activity, their data charts, the graphic organizers, lots of dynamic, authentic assessment. In fact, organic and authentic are words I really like to think about in terms of problem-based learning, because all of this just flows from the problem so naturally. The kids feel like they're in a real world environment. They think that they are engaging in a simulation of something important in the world, and their willingness to go further is really much rooted in that. Nothing seems superfluous. It is also a great environment for differentiation in the regular classroom, where everybody gets to learn essential information about habitats and biomes and endangered species, but the gifted can learn those higher level things in working groups of their own on the advanced understanding of the concept, long-range thinking, consideration of intended and unintended consequences, reading primary resources that are more advanced, and interdisciplinary understanding. I won't go into this today because we're running out of time, but there is a depth of research in problem-based learning that far exceeds almost anything else we have, probably anything else we have in gifted education. I think that one of the most compelling things we have is that we know if the problem is carefully constructed around learning goals, kids will learn just as much as anyone would under a lecture-based situation, and they will be more engaged and more satisfied with their learning than in a didactic classroom. This study is also important, especially when we think back to the keynote this morning, because one of the things we found about problem-based learning is that because it's so engaging to kids, kids who are the diamonds in the rough, who don't show up well on the identification matrix, don't do well on standardized tests, do show up in the problem-based learning classroom. I have seen this happen across several Javits grants. When I go into a classroom, you'll always find this shining light that hadn't shown up before, because the problem itself draws the skill, draws the thinking out of the students. Even more compelling are the kids' words. This is from a group of middle school students who were part of the pilot test for this particular unit. What did they learn? It was deeper than just learning from a textbook. It helped me understand interactions in ecosystems better. I also liked how the problem led to learning other things about niches. And these are, I should say, what they thought were the advantages of the unit. We were learning 2 things without knowing it. Everything we learned was connected and easy to understand.
Dr. Gallagher?
Yes.
We only have about 5 minutes left, and there are a couple questions.
Okay. Go ahead, Chris. Let's do that. People can read the slides.
Okay. So for your Blackfoot ferret unit, how long does that take traditionally?
Well, that's hard to answer in a short form. It can take as short as 2 weeks, and it can go as long as you want it to.
Okay. When you were talking about getting headlines to draw on student interest, have you found that there is a particular type of headline that garners more student engagement?
I think they love contemporary pieces. When working with middle school students, I used to say small animals and ooze. Those were the 2 things that were really compelling. But I would also say this. I have found that even when we chose problems that the kids didn't really resonate with immediately, their passion would develop over time. And even if that never happened, and that's happened a couple times, they love being in charge. And that sense of autonomy will drive them as much as anything.
So a little bit in terms of the time question, how would you suggest managing PBL in a weekly or biweekly pullout model?
I get that often. I think you have to be ready to spend a quarter on the problem, first of all. So, you know, that 9 weeks is pretty essential. I think the way you manage that is first by making use of those kickers, those little storyline inserts to reinvest the kids in the problem. So I would really make use of that. And the other thing I would do is use the internet, you know, set up a Google Classroom or a site where the kids could blog or converse, report out information in between times so that there's some continuity.
Are there any additional questions for Dr. Gallagher? Or what other additional questions do we have if we could put those in chat?
I'm going to go ahead. I really, at some point, please go back and read these student comments because they're wonderful, but I have to share the one about, this is the one. Helped me realize how we solve problems today in the adult world. I learned that not everything can be fixed with duct tape. While people are typing, and interrupt me, Chris, if you need to, I just want to point out that problem-based learning, again, going back to the keynote, actually provides a foundation for culturally relevant curriculum. When you take a look at research on how students from different backgrounds respond to the classroom, we find that they respond better in a culturally relevant setting where it's focused on interdependence and group success, where there's reliance on collective wisdom, where there's opportunity for group interaction and dialogue, where group dynamics are important. It's collaborative and relational. And I think problem-based learning does all of that. What we need to do in PBL to build on that is to choose problems that are reflective of different kids' life experiences. So, and I've done problems on Brown versus Board of Education, where the kids are in the role of Thurgood Marshall. Certainly the study of poverty in the Hull House or our child labor unit. It goes to that. Right before the shutdown, I just started working on a new unit on the Greensboro sit-in that actually combines that with the artwork of Jacob Lawrence. And I just can't wait to get back to that. But, you know, there's just a wealth of ideas to work on in terms of putting culturally relevant content into this environment.
All right, we have one more question. Would you consider Future City to be PBL or project-based?
I think of it as more as project-based. Yeah, I think of it as more as project-based.
Okay, all righty. Unfortunately, we are at our time limit. Thank you, Dr. Gallagher, for taking time out of your Friday to give a wonderful keynote and to give a wonderful address. Several of the people were asking if we could get copies of the slideshow to send out.
Absolutely.
So we'll make sure to send those out. You're getting lots of thanks in the chat. For our members, we are going to have a 15-minute break. The break video this time is just our sponsor video that was playing during the beginning. Our break ends at 11 o'clock, and at that time we will have more breakout sessions. If you need help getting the links for rooms A, B, or C to work, just put that in chat and we're more than happy to help. All right, so thank you again, Dr. Gallagher.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful conference and thanks for inviting me.